Hello, my name is Daniel Tucker, and I'm an assistant professor and graduate program director in socially engaged art at Moore College of Art and Design in Philadelphia. Today, I'm going to share with you a range of pedagogical experiments that have taken place at both the undergraduate and graduate level at Moore over the last academic year. In this presentation, Care Crisis, Teaching Art, Media, and Curating During a Pandemic, I will review a range of pedagogical experiments thematizing the topic of care work, or what advocate Ai-jen Poo calls the work that makes all other work possible. And I'm going to, in particular, look at the way in which this theme of care has been taken up for curatorial and art students. The presentation will offer an overview of how this year-long project was facilitated, review documentation of student work from an ongoing online archive, and speculate about lessons it can offer for pandemic as well as post-pandemic arts education. This work began from an observation that many students in our school had an interest in care work, and this preceded the pandemic. It also originated from an observation that several undergraduate courses were already collaborating with senior centers in the area here in Philadelphia, and that there was also potential to shed light on how art and design students might interface with the healthcare sector in particular. And so my collaborators, Lauren Sichter, Maya Pendyke, and Pat Ma from the Office of Development and Advancement here at Moore applied for a grant from the Lindback Foundation in order to pursue this theme of care and aging. And I want to, in particular, give thanks to Pat Ma and Liz Cahill from the Office of Advancement at Moore for securing this funding, as well as to the academic dean, Patty Phillips, for supporting these kinds of experimental collaborations between faculty. I'd also like to thank my collaborators, Maya Pendyke, Lauren Stichter, as well as Nihad Kader, who also developed care crisis projects for their courses in the fall of 2020 and spring 2021. After receiving this grant, the global pandemic took place and dramatically changed all facets of life, including the cultural sector and the field of education, as this conference in particular is taking up. Beyond those changes, the social movements around health equity and racial justice, combined with a tremendous internal challenge and stress for everyone, but students in particular, this theme of care took on a deeper meaning as it manifested not only as a concern in daily life, but also as a regular, recurring conversation within the experimental space of the virtual classroom. So in my fall courses last year, I invited visiting artists Caroline Woolard, Phoebe Bachman, and archivist Sinatra Smith and Marianne Williams to visit the virtual classroom and talk about their work archiving this particular moment in history. In the fall of 2020, the prompt that I ended up providing to my undergraduate and graduate students at the beginning of the semester was to write about how the pandemic was impacting fields that they work in, including the arts and curatorial practice. Specifically, they were asked, how have artists and curators been responding to this moment of health, climate, political, economic crisis, and movements for racial justice? This resulted in numerous profiles and interviews, including, for example, a write-up about the COVID Art Museum, or CAM, which was profiled by BFA student Olivia Downs as a newly created Instagram museum that featured art made during the pandemic, while BFA student Layla Islam discussed the hashtag museum from home and how existing institutions were adapting to the closures as a result of the pandemic. Bay Warner, another BFA student, wrote in their profile about the Artist in Quarantine series that showcases Middle Eastern artist spaces and their studios during the pandemic. An MFA student, Ann Siriani, wrote about how the Minneapolis Institute of Art had been doing programming around the theme of self-care, which was called Virtual Care Package. These were all housed in an online collaborative catalog called Care Crisis, a time capsule about art and curating during the pandemic from students at Moore College of Art and Design, which is continuing to unfold and will soon have a print component. Teaching online on a temporary basis in courses that foreground experiential and project-based learning presented a unique opportunity to figure out how the kind of partnerships that the courses that I typically taught could form around a remote learning partnership. And so there was a remote learning collaboration that I developed with the Movement Alliance Project and their initiative, which is a media archive called the People's Media Record. The goal of this work for the students was to contribute to the Movement Alliance Project's ongoing indexing of their raw video footage documenting Philadelphia activism in order to license and share that video footage with researchers and activists. I should note that this partnership was facilitated by Helix Horowitz from the Movement Alliance Project and would not have been possible without their collaboration and just general openness to working with the students in this remote fashion. But I should emphasize that because the work is digital video and it's an online archive, the fact that it was already living online and it was digitally native content allowed students who were studying curating a chance to work within the terms of an existing archive and also to brush up on their skills as digital archivists. Following the completion of the indexing that they did of that footage, the students were then invited to develop an exhibition inspired by that video footage, which was all derived from a 2015 documentary called Groundwork: Justice in the Birthplace of America that the Movement Alliance Project had developed with a team of video activists in Philadelphia back in 2015. In order to brainstorm for the development of this exhibition, because exhibition making is, something that oftentimes happens in a more of a kind of collaborative studio atmosphere, we ended up using Miro boards for students to be able to work in an asynchronous manner. Out of the work, the students created Groundwork: Revisiting Philadelphia Media Activism Through Archiving, a series of posters that looked at the relevance of the video footage for contemporary economic, education, and environmental justice activism. Following the exhibition, they developed a community engagement plan for continuing their work after the pandemic. Through this partnership, students demonstrated care for the city that they live in and its social movement history. That such a partnership could form the basis of an exhibition and an exhibit and curatorial design process allowed curatorial students to experience what a non-extractive community partnership could look like, which is certainly something that will continue to serve their work moving forward as they think about how collaborations can be formed in order to enrich exhibition making practices. As part of the courses that wrote the profiles about the pandemic, and how arts institutions responded to the pandemic, the students were also then invited to develop more ambitious interview projects for the online catalog as their final contributions, their final projects for both the undergraduate and graduate curatorial practice courses that I was teaching at the time. So I'd like to share two short student presentations about the work that they developed, and then share a little bit more about the programming that happened in the spring semester. So now we'll hear from Carolina Marin Hernandez and Emily Elliott, who were two students in these fall 2020 courses.
Since March, since the shutdown, we've all been dealing with the separation and the crises and how we're managing our lives as art students, artists, program directors. And since March, I've been trying to find ways that people can connect and that people are coping, and ways that folks are dealing with these crises and still trying to live their lives as people. So for the curatorial class that I take with Daniel Tucker, I made this interview format, and I decided on using Prezi because Prezi is a very interactive form for web-based things. And I wanted it to be interactive because when you're, one of the things that I've embraced, even though it's not my favorite thing, is that so many things that we're doing are virtual and there's not a whole lot we can do about it. If we're being responsible and if we're being careful, we need to be not meeting in person in large groups and not, being in intimate spaces with each other. So we had to come up with different ways to do that. And one of which is making things web-based. So that's been my exploration. So the Prezi just walks us through, this year has been insane: pandemic, lockdown, unemployment, the murder of Black folks by police, wildfires, hurricanes, and most contentious political atmosphere in ages. It's straight up apocalyptic. And, this talks about a little bit about how we are creating our lives. How are we fulfilling our needs? The process, I interviewed 3 folks from my socially engaged studio art MFA program, trying to suss out the commonalities. The more that we're able to share with one another, the more we're able to figure out our best coping mechanisms. And so this is just a place that we could share, and that was important to me. So
yeah, thanks for sharing, Emily. I really appreciate it, and for doing this work and engaging people in this what is surely a really challenging time for everyone, but I think that you're able to capture that it lands for people in different ways, and people have different approaches to engaging it. So I feel like you were really able to capture that. Carolina, just to share a little bit about what you ended up writing and who you interacted with, and how you responded to the care crisis prompt. Just would love to hear what you've been working on.
Sure. So during the pandemic, I became interested in corn and corn byproducts, which meant that I spent hours upon hours just looking at different resources, different artists, and also looking at the food industry itself to see what they were doing with corn, specifically with corn husks and traditions like making tamales and arepas. So while I was just scrolling through all these things, I came across Ana Caballero, who was doing Proyecto Tamal and who is currently still doing Proyecto Tamal. So for this article, I really just wanted to focus on how food justice and the food service industry now can be recontextualized and I guess defined as socially engaged art. So looking at it through that lens, seeing what kind of practices overlap with studio practices as well, because tamal making is very involved in like sculptural techniques, and also just the engagement with an entire network of people outside and within a food service industry can be part of a socially engaged art practice. So I spoke first with Ana Caballero, and we basically just talked about the process of making tamales, who she interacts with, where we're sourcing masa from, where we're sourcing the corn and labor from. And she treats Proyecto Tamal as more of a collaborative practice rather than, I guess, the right or not the right word, but like a word to use would be charity. It's not considered a charity. It's a collaboration with different cooks, with different chefs, different people within the food service industry who were not able to have any government access or government aid. So yeah, I spoke to her at first, and then I spoke to Carly of the People's Kitchen, who also works for 215 People's Alliance. And with Carly's organization, we were able to talk more about how community engagement plays a role in the way that these collaborations are formed. So we talked about the community garden and its effects and its continuous effects on the way People's Kitchen continues as an organization. We also talked about the way that distributing the food is another form of networking and another, I guess, cog in this entire system that she's built and that her collaborators have helped build. Yeah, so it's really much it's about like collaboration. It's about how these collaborations should be treated as the product, and also how the act of engaging with others is part of this product, because when we talk about art we usually talk about the product or the end result and not the process. But really, when it comes to these two organizations, the process is the product.
The final example that I'd like to show is a series of public events that were organized as part of this care crisis series, on the theme of care, on the theme of health, and on the theme of essential work. You know, all topics that have emerged, you know, as areas of great social importance, as well as subject matter for artistic investigation during the pandemic, as well as some examples that we looked at of projects that far preceded the current pandemic. And so the first example is a partnership that we developed with Jefferson University's Health and Humanities initiative. And this was a public lecture as well as a reading group with students from Moore and Jefferson that focused on Anne Basting's work and her recently released book, which is called Creative Care, that focuses on working artists, working particularly in the healthcare sector with a focus on aging populations, as well as people experiencing dementia and their communities and families. Another program that we developed was with Moore's Wallentis Fellow, which is Alicia Grulon, who had a dialogue with the curator, Laura Reykjavik. And in this dialogue, they talked about some of the work that Alicia has been doing depicting essential workers through a photo series that she's done during quarantine. Also, as part of this series, we worked together with the galleries at Moore, who ended up developing kind of a roundtable discussion with a local group here in Philadelphia, the Creative Resilience Collective, that was about collaborative self-care and community care. Other faculty have also been developing assignments. So for instance, Nehad Kader assigned her students interviews that are posted on the Care Crisis website. Maya Pindyke has done a creative writing project with seniors, and Lauren Stichter has also had some workshops in her art education courses dealing with partnerships around senior centers in the Philadelphia area. So, I'd like to point out that by having multiple courses in multiple departments assign thematically similar work, we were able to kind of stitch together a conversation about online adaptations happening in the field during the pandemic, as well as just conversations about care more broadly and how it was relevant to different disciplines and departments within the school. And so I would just conclude, by emphasizing that these kinds of informal collaborations and the contact that often lead to this kind of work were really challenging at this time, because we're not able to just run into each other in the hallway or go to each other's programs in the same way that we do in person. And so we needed to create this kind of shared frame at the beginning of the academic year, which could then facilitate this kind of invisible thread, again, this stitching together of a common theme across multiple courses. This kind of thread connecting different coursework has a benefit in that it connects to the lived experience of student at a time when we cannot afford to be disconnected from ourselves or from one another. And so I want to just conclude by saying that doing this work collaboratively with students and other faculty across the school has offered an opportunity, again, to encourage that kind of cross-curricular conversation. But on a personal level, I can say it made it feel like my teaching was relevant and engaged in the present moment in the way that felt the safest, but also the most responsive that I could muster at this challenging and unique time. And I'm still figuring out what implications this might have for my teaching moving forward. But I can say that the premise of a kind of shared frame to connect not only the courses I'm teaching, but also to partner with other faculty across the school really made it feel like there was a generative, ongoing conversation that that I would like to continue in some manner moving forward. So thank you for your time, and to the conference for hosting this presentation.